start by looking at the data dictionary. We click on the data dictionary navigator item on the left hand side and we'll see here the data dictionary area. Now what you're looking at is a table of all of the dictionary elements that are currently available within the application. But of course you might want to add your own elements, and so in this area you're able to create your own different element type depending on what you're after, whether it's a raw element, a computed element, a cohort element, or a complex dashboard computation. But first of all, let's just cover off quickly this table. You can search for things very quickly here on the right hand side. For example, if you were looking for the birth date of a patient, so that's a raw element, and you can see here that it's available. You can also look at things. You can just simply click on the view menu and it will show that particular raw element and any of the metadata that's associated to that raw element. At the moment there's not a great deal of metadata available, even though some of these items are already in there, and that's because we haven't had clinicians come through and approve these yet or put some of this data in. But I'm guessing that's probably why you're here, because you might be adding some of that data yourself. Certainly when you create a new element, you'll be putting a lot of this data in, and that's going to help the next person who wants to use your particular raw element or other element that you've created. Okay, so let's have a look briefly at a raw element or any of the elements. They're always going to consist of a number of fields up the top, the metadata here, which you typically fill in, but then also it might show you some dependencies, it might show you that in a graphical format. There's also some history down here of who created it and who changed it and made changes, so there's an audit trail as well. Okay, well I've talked a little bit about elements, but what actually are they? Well, a raw element is a fundamental piece of data or variable that's typically captured in the database, okay, in a single field. So what this means for you is that probably a piece of data that has been entered on one of the Cerner Millennium screens or your data source screen, that's saved somewhere in the database, and when you then define a raw element, you're defining what this actual piece of data is. So that's a raw element. But you may also want something a little bit more complicated than that. Say for example a computed element. Now once again, if you want to, we can search for we can use the search to search for computed elements, or we can use a simple filter here, which is probably what you used to within Microsoft Excel, and you can filter everything and look at the computer elements that are available. Now some of these are quite complex ones that have been seeded already from existing data requests. So before we looked at viewing a particular data element, but you can also edit them if you've got rights to edit that element. So if you click on the little pencil, it pulls this form up and you can actually make changes and then save those changes here. Once again, the same sort of data exists in here, but this time we have something down the bottom which is the definition, and it's actually in the form of a tree. Now some are more complex than others and you can create reasonably straightforward ones, but what these allow you to do is a computed element consists of a formula normally, which is a computation based on other raw elements or other raw elements and computed elements. So for example, you might want just the year out of the birth date that we looked at before, then you can use a specific function that just selects the year from that birth date. What other types of elements are there? Well, one of the most important elements is a cohort element. Let's take a look at one of those now. So I'll use this feature again to try and find our cohorts. There's all sorts of different cohorts that have been described here. Once again, I can view them or I can edit them. Okay, I can also copy them, by the way. If I find one that's interesting, I could copy it and then just modify it slightly. But in this case, let's just take a look at this particular cohort. Once again, we've got the standard metadata information that's up the top here, and we have, in this case, a lot more dependencies, and we have a dependency graph that you're looking at, which just shows all of the data, all of the other elements that this particular element depends on. We've got our history again, but this time we've got a much larger definition, and this definition looks a bit more like a Boolean tree because it says, well, I want this and this. So in this case it's the person ID is equal to this. I also want the catalog type code is in these values, the task state is in these values. Now this is a very complex this is a very complex cohort definition that's described here, used for a very specific and technical task. Yours might be a lot more straightforward than that. But it gives you an idea about how they're structured so that you can see that you can build your own tree, and we'll have a separate video where we show you how to do that, so that you can describe the patients that you might want to collect data for. The last type of element available in the dictionary is called a dashboard complex computation. I'm not going to spend much time on that. It's simply it's a computation that you might describe in a lot more detail that occurs actually on a dashboard itself. But for now, I don't think we need to know much more about that.